The cold wind bit at his cheeks as he shuffled toward the school gates. His clothes hung off him, oversized and worn, layers of patches and loose threads barely keeping him warm. His coat, if you could call it that, flapped against his thin frame like a flag of defeat. His shoes were mismatched and too small, the tips scuffed and peeling, with frayed laces dragging behind him. Yet he walked with purpose. Not fast, not slow. Just steady. The schoolyard buzzed with life as kids in freshly pressed uniforms ran, laughed, and greeted each other. Their backpacks were bright and colorful, filled with lunches carefully packed by doting parents. He kept his gaze on the cracked pavement as he entered, clutching the strap of his faded second-hand bag. It didn't take long before they noticed him. It never did. "Hey, look who it is!" A voice rang out, sharp and teasing. The boy didn't stop walking. He had learned a long time ago that stopping only gave them more reason to poke fun. A group of kids huddled near the fence, laughing among themselves. The ringleader, a tall boy with perfectly combed blonde hair and a jacket that looked far too expensive for a child, grinned as he pointed toward him. "Nice shoes, pal. Did the garbage can give you those?" Laughter erupted. One of the girls snorted, covering her mouth as though she couldn't help herself. Another kid slapped the blonde boy on the back, egging him on. The boy kept walking, his steps steady. The laughter followed him like a shadow. He could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up, looking for more things to pick apart. "Where'd you get that coat?" A girl with a ribbon in her hair called out. "Did a rat sew it together for you?" He ignored her. The words hit him, but he had spent so many years building walls that they didn't penetrate the way they used to. Not on the outside, anyway. He kept his eyes down, focused on the uneven pavement, one crack at a time. "Are you mute or just stupid?" the blonde boy shouted after him. More laughter. The boy's grip tightened on his bag strap, but he didn't turn around. He knew what would happen if he did. He had learned that lesson too many times. "Better keep walking," another voice jeered. "Maybe someone will throw you a coin if you beg hard enough." That one stung. He felt his cheeks burn, though he wasn't sure if it was anger, shame, or something in between. He reached the school doors and slipped inside, grateful for the temporary silence as they stayed behind, congratulating each other on their jokes. Inside the hallway, the noise was different, busy and chaotic, but less cruel. He exhaled a shaky breath and adjusted the strap of his bag. "Excuse me," a voice said, startling him. He turned to see a girl from his class standing there. She was wearing the same neat uniform as everyone else, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her face wasn't unkind, but there was curiosity in her eyes that made him wary. "You dropped this." She held out a pencil, its eraser worn down to the metal. It wasn't his, but he took it anyway. "Thanks," he mumbled. She studied him for a second longer. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" The question hit him like a slap. He blinked at her, unsure how to respond. "Doesn't it bother you?" she pressed. "When they say those things?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, he turned and walked toward his classroom, leaving her standing there with a pencil still in her hand. The classroom was warm, the sunlight spilling in through the large windows, but it offered no comfort. The boy took his usual seat at the back of the room, where the desks were old and covered in graffiti. His chair wobbled slightly, but he didn't mind. It was better to stay unnoticed. As the other kids filed in, their chatter filled the room like a buzzing hive. The blonde boy, his name was Lucas, though the boy never said it aloud, came in with his group, taking seats near the front. Lucas smirked as he glanced back, locking eyes with him. "Bet he doesn't even have lunch," Lucas muttered to his friends, loud enough for the entire row to hear. The boy looked away, staring down at the desk as though he hadn't heard. He felt his stomach turn. "All right, settle down," the teacher called as she entered the room. The class quieted. The teacher was a middle-aged woman with stern eyes and a no-nonsense voice, but she didn't look at the boy any differently than she did the others. To her, he was just another student. He preferred it that way. "Open your books to chapter 3, the teacher instructed. "And Daniel, please start reading for us." The boy Daniel tensed. The room fell still as all eyes turned to him. His throat felt dry, but he swallowed hard and stood up, pulling his worn textbook from his bag. The edges were frayed, and the spine had split in places, but it was still usable. Lucas snickered from the front row. "Careful, don't rip it." It probably cost him his entire allowance. Daniel ignored him, focusing on the words in front of him. He began to read, his voice soft at first but steady. As he read, the room grew quieter. He wasn't just reading, he was reading well. His tone carried emotion, his words clear and precise, like he had practiced them 100 times. When he finished, the teacher smiled faintly. "Well done, Daniel." Daniel sat back down, avoiding eye contact. For a brief moment, he felt something like pride swell in his chest, until Lucas ruined it. "Maybe his parents were actors before they dumped him," Lucas whispered. Daniel flinched, his fingers digging into the desk. He bit the inside of his cheek to stop himself from saying anything. "Enough, Lucas," the teacher snapped, shooting him a warning glare. Lucas shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. The damage was already done. At lunchtime, Daniel sat alone on a bench outside. He had no lunch bag to open, no sandwich to eat. He pulled his knees up to his chest, staring at the cracked concrete beneath his feet. "Did you forget your lunch again?" Daniel looked up to see the same girl from earlier. She stood a few feet away, holding her lunch tray. He shrugged. "I'm not hungry." "That's a lie," she said plainly. "Everyone's hungry at lunch." Daniel didn't respond. He expected her to walk away, but instead, she sat down beside him. He shifted uncomfortably and used to the company. "I'm Emily," she said after a moment. Daniel glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. "I know." Emily smiled faintly. "I know your name, too." "Daniel, right?" He nodded, not sure what to say. "Here." Emily held out an apple. "You can have this." "I'm not going to finish it." Daniel stared at the apple like it was a foreign object. "I don't need it." "Just take it," she insisted. "It's not charity. It's just an apple." Reluctantly, Daniel took it, turning it over in his hands. He hadn't eaten since the night before, and his stomach growled despite himself. "Thanks," he mumbled. Emily didn't say anything else. She sat with him for a while, quietly eating the rest of her lunch as if sitting with Daniel was the most normal thing in the world. But from across the yard, Lucas and his friends were watching. Lucas leaned back against the fence, his smug grin widening as he watched Emily sitting next to Daniel. The other kids gathered around him, drawn in by his confident presence like moths to a flame. "Look at that," Lucas said, gesturing toward the bench. "Princess Emily has a new charity project. Isn't that sweet?" The others snickered, though some glanced at each other uneasily. Emily wasn't the type of girl people usually teased. She was smart, confident, and had a way of putting people in their place. But with Lucas leading the charge, no one dared to say anything out loud. "You think she feels sorry for him?" one of Lucas's friends asked. "Of course she does," Lucas replied, his tone mocking. "I mean, look at him. The kid doesn't even have lunch. She probably gave him that apple because she feels bad." More laughter. Lucas pushed off the fence and started walking toward the bench, his pack of friends trailing behind him. "Where are you going?" one of the girls asked. "To remind Emily that she doesn't belong with losers like him," Lucas said with a smirk. Daniel saw them coming before Emily did. He had a sixth sense for this sort of thing. Trouble always announced itself when Lucas was involved. He tensed as Lucas and his friends approached, their footsteps deliberate and slow, like predators stalking their prey. Emily noticed Daniel's sudden shift in posture. "What's wrong?" Before he could answer, Lucas's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Emily turned around, her brow furrowing when she saw Lucas. "What do you want, Lucas?" Lucas smiled, all charm and poison. "Nothing much. Just wondering why you're sitting here when there's an entire table waiting for you over there." "I'm fine where I am," Emily replied coolly. Lucas's grin faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. He turned his attention to Daniel, his eyes narrowing with mock concern. "Hey, buddy, you enjoying that apple? It must be the best meal you've had all week." Daniel said nothing, his grip tightening on the apple. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Lucas continued. He looked at Emily. "You really have a soft spot for strays, don't you?" "Leave him alone, Lucas," Emily snapped. Lucas raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Emily. I'm just trying to have a conversation. It's not my fault he can't talk." Daniel's face burned, but he kept his eyes down. He knew better than to engage. Lucas loved it when people fought back. It gave him an excuse to keep going. Maybe he's saving his words for something important, Lucas added, leaning closer. Or maybe he's just embarrassed. I mean, can you blame him? Look at him. Emily stood up abruptly, her expression thunderous. What is your problem, Lucas? Lucas blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her sudden anger. What? I'm just saying. You're a jerk, Emily interrupted. You think being rich makes you better than everyone else? You think it gives you the right to treat people like this? The other kids watched in stunned silence. No one ever spoke to Lucas like that. Lucas's face darkened. Careful, Emily. You don't want to start hanging out with losers like him. People might start thinking you're one too. Better a loser than a bully, Emily shot back. Daniel risked a glance up at her, surprised. He wasn't used to people standing up for him. Most kids either ignored him or joined in with the teasing. But Emily didn't back down, not even when Lucas's smile disappeared entirely. Lucas looked at Daniel again, his lip curling. Whatever. He's not worth it anyway. He turned back to Emily, his voice dripping with condescension. You'll figure that out eventually. Without another word, Lucas turned and walked away, his friends following closely behind him. The tension in the air lingered even after they were gone. Emily sat back down with a sigh, shaking her head. I can't stand him. Daniel stared at her, still holding the apple in his hand. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Emily replied firmly. Someone needed to. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to kindness, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Are you okay? Emily asked, looking at him with genuine concern. Daniel nodded, though his voice came out small. Yeah. Emily studied him for a moment longer before turning her attention back to her lunch. She didn't press him for more, and for that he was grateful. He took a bite of the apple, the sweet taste surprising him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. That afternoon, the classroom was unusually quiet. The teacher had assigned an independent reading period, and everyone was focused on their books. Well, almost everyone. Lucas sat near the front, occasionally glancing back at Daniel, who was seated in his usual spot at the back of the room. Daniel kept his head down, his eyes scanning the same page over and over, without really reading it. He could feel Lucas watching him, and it made his skin crawl. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the weight of those eyes. Finally, Lucas leaned over to one of his friends, whispering something that made the other boy snicker. A moment later, Lucas's voice rang out, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Hey, Daniel. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. He didn't look up. The teacher glanced up from her desk. Lucas, quiet down. Sorry, Miss Thompson, Lucas said quickly, though the smirk on his face said otherwise. He turned back to his friend and muttered something under his breath, his eyes flicking toward Daniel once more. Daniel clenched his fists under the desk, willing himself to stay calm. He had heard it all before. The taunts, the whispers, the insults. But something about today felt different. The anger was harder to push down. When the bell finally rang, Daniel was the first to leave the classroom. He stuffed his book into his bag and rushed out the door, his heart still racing. Daniel! He heard Emily's voice behind him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He needed air. He pushed through the school doors and out into the empty courtyard, the cold wind hitting him like a wall. He stopped near the edge of the yard, his breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. Hey. Emily's voice was closer now. A moment later, she appeared beside him, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. What's wrong? She asked, panting slightly from running after him. Nothing, Daniel mumbled, staring at the ground. Emily frowned. That's not true. You ran out of there like the building was on fire. Did Lucas say something to you again? Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Daniel, Emily said softly, stepping closer. You don't have to let him get to you. He's just... It's not that simple, Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. Emily blinked, taken aback. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Sorry, I don't want to talk about it. Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. Okay. They stood there in silence, the wind whistling between the cracks in the pavement. Finally, Emily spoke. You know, he's not as tough as he pretends to be. Daniel glanced at her, frowning. What do you mean? Lucas, Emily said. He acts like he's untouchable, but he's not. He just doesn't want anyone to see how small he really is. Daniel looked away, her words stirring something inside him. He had never thought of Lucas as anything other than a bully, a force that couldn't be stopped. But Emily made him wonder. "Why do you care?" Daniel asked quietly. Emily shrugged. "Because no one else does." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to make of Emily or her kindness. It felt unfamiliar, like a language he didn't know how to speak. "Come on," Emily said after a moment, nudging his arm. "Let's go back inside. It's freezing out here." Daniel hesitated before nodding. Together, they walked back toward the school, the wind carrying their footsteps across the empty courtyard. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he wasn't walking alone. The afternoon dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. Daniel sat in the back of the classroom again, pretending to focus on the teacher's lecture. In truth, his thoughts were a tangled mess, swirling between the apple Emily had given him, Lucas's endless taunts, and the weight of the paper crumpled deep in his pocket. That paper. It was more than just words. It was everything he had left. Everything that mattered. He clutched it every night, like a lifeline to a memory he couldn't let go of. Daniel, the teacher's voice suddenly cut through his thoughts. His head snapped up, and he realized everyone was staring at him. "Huh? I asked you a question," Miss Thompson said patiently. "Can you tell us the answer?" Daniel's face burned. He hadn't heard the question. A few giggles floated up from the front of the room, Lucas's voice the loudest among them. "You're wasting your time, Miss Thompson," Lucas said smugly. "I doubt he even knows what page we're on." The teacher's expression darkened. "Lucas, that's enough." Daniel lowered his gaze to his desk, the shame creeping up his neck. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor. "Daniel," Miss Thompson said softly, "can you see me after class, please?" He nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Lucas's friends snickered, and Daniel could hear their whispers behind him. When the bell rang, Daniel waited for everyone else to leave before gathering his things. He moved slowly, deliberately, hoping Lucas and his pack would be gone before he left the room. "Come on, let's go," he heard Lucas mutter to his friends. "We've got better things to do than waste time here." They filed out, leaving Daniel in blessed silence. Miss Thompson approached his desk, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "Daniel, are you doing okay?" Daniel stiffened. "I'm fine." "You're not in trouble," she assured him. I've noticed you've been quiet lately. More than usual." He stared down at his hands, gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't want to talk about it. Adults always acted like they cared, but he knew better. They would ask questions and say comforting things, but they wouldn't understand. "Is something happening with the other students?" she pressed gently. You can talk to me." Daniel shook his head. "It's nothing." Miss Thompson studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay. But if you need anything at all, you can come to me. You don't have to deal with things alone, Daniel." He swallowed hard, her words chipping away at the wall he had carefully built around himself. He didn't respond, just grabbed his bag and stood up. "Thank you," he muttered quietly before slipping out of the classroom. The walk home was long, the wind colder than it had been that morning. Daniel kept his head down as he trudged through the streets, his hands buried in his pockets. He passed the same rows of houses, each one neat and warm-looking, their windows glowing softly with light. He didn't live in a house like that. His home was a rundown building at the edge of town, a shelter for kids like him. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping on the streets. When he finally pushed through the shelter's creaky front door, he was greeted by the faint smell of stale food and cleaning supplies. A few kids sat at a table in the corner, playing with battered toys or scribbling on scraps of paper. The shelter workers moved quietly, their tired faces focused on the tasks in front of them. Daniel headed straight for his cot, dropping his bag at the foot of it. He sank onto the thin mattress and reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled paper. He smoothed it out carefully, his fingers tracing the familiar creases. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges frayed, but the words were still legible. It was a letter. A letter from his mother. He read it for what must have been the 1,000th time, his eyes lingering on the words that meant the most to him. "Daniel, no matter what happens, always remember who you are. You are strong. You are loved. And one day, you will prove to the world just how much you matter. His throat tightened. He could hear her voice in the words, soft and comforting, like a lullaby he hadn't heard in years. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. It was all he had left of her. The next day, Daniel woke up before the sun. He dressed quietly, pulling on the same patched clothes he had worn the day before, and grabbed his bag. He was out the door before anyone else had even stirred. At school, the courtyard was empty, the air still and quiet. Daniel liked it that way. It gave him time to breathe, to prepare himself for whatever the day might bring. He sat on the steps leading up to the building, watching as the sky gradually lightened. The quiet was nice, peaceful. Daniel! The voice startled him, and he looked up to see Emily standing there, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her coat. "You're here early," she said, sitting down beside him. "So are you," he replied, his voice soft. Emily shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the horizon. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" Emily asked finally, breaking the stillness. Daniel didn't answer right away. "Because it doesn't matter." Emily frowned. "Of course it matters. You shouldn't let people treat you that way." Daniel turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What am I supposed to do? Fight back? Say something? It won't change anything." "Yes, it will," Emily insisted. "People like Lucas think they can get away with it because no one stops them. But you're stronger than you think." Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," Emily said softly. Daniel hesitated. The words were there, lodged in his throat, but saying them out loud felt impossible. Finally, he said, "I don't care what Lucas says. He doesn't know anything about me." "Then tell me," Emily pressed. "What does he not know?" Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, my dad always says that the truth has a way of shutting people up. Maybe Lucas wouldn't be so smug if he knew what you're really about." Daniel didn't respond, but her words lingered. He wasn't sure why Emily cared so much, but a part of him wanted to believe her, that the truth could change things. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Lucas and his group were approaching, their voices loud and full of energy. Emily turned to look at them, her expression hardening. "Here we go," she muttered. Daniel stood up, bracing himself for what was coming. Lucas spotted them immediately, a grin spreading across his face. Well, look who's here," Lucas drawled as he approached. Daniel and his bodyguard. Emily stood up beside Daniel, her eyes narrowing. "Don't you have anything better to do, Lucas?" "Nope," Lucas replied cheerfully. "Watching you two is the highlight of my day." He turned his attention to Daniel, his grin turning cold. "How's life in a trash heap, Daniel?" Daniel said nothing, his shoulders tensing. "What's wrong?" Lucas continued. "Cat got your tongue again? Or are you too busy counting all those invisible dollars you don't have?" Emily stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "That's enough, Lucas." Lucas ignored her, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "You know, I've been wondering about something. What's in that little pocket of yours? You're always holding on to it like it's worth something." Daniel's breath caught. He instinctively shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, clutching the letter tightly. Lucas smirked. "Come on, show us. What's so special about it?" "No," Daniel said quietly. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said no," Daniel repeated, his voice louder this time. Lucas's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. "What's the big deal? If it's so important, let's see it." "I told you to leave him alone," Emily said sharply. Lucas ignored her, stepping closer to Daniel. "What's the matter? Afraid we'll see that it's just another piece of trash?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He clutched the letter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he met Lucas's gaze head-on, his voice steady. "It's not trash," he said. Lucas's smirk returned. "Prove it." The air felt heavier, like the entire courtyard was holding its breath. Lucas stepped closer, his grin stretching wider, a predator sensing blood. His friends gathered behind him, watching eagerly, waiting for something, anything to happen. Daniel's hand tightened around the letter, the paper crinkling under his grip. Emily stood beside him, her shoulders squared and fists clenched, ready to jump in if Lucas pushed too far. "Why don't you just show us what's in your pocket?" Lucas said, his voice laced with mockery. "Or are you scared? Is it something embarrassing?" A love note to Emily. Laughter erupted behind him. Lucas smirked, clearly pleased with himself. Daniel didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Lucas, refusing to look away. His heart was racing, but he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "It's none of your business," he said quietly, his voice steady. Lucas tilted his head, feigning confusion. "What was that?" "Speak up. I can't hear you over how pathetic you are." Emily stepped forward, placing herself between Lucas and Daniel. "Leave him alone, Lucas. You're nothing but a bully." Lucas's grin faded, his eyes hardening. "Why do you care so much, Emily? He's not your problem. He's a nobody. Everyone here knows it. Maybe because I actually have a heart." Emily shot back, her voice sharp. "Unlike you." Lucas's face flushed, and for a second, Daniel thought he might actually back off. But Lucas was too proud for that. He wouldn't let Emily embarrass him in front of his friends. "Fine," Lucas said, his tone turning cold. "If he won't show us what's in his pocket, I'll just take it." Before anyone could react, Lucas lunged forward, his hand reaching for Daniel. "No." Daniel shouted, stumbling back. He twisted to the side, trying to keep the letter out of Lucas's reach, but Lucas was faster. He grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him off balance. "Stop it," Emily yelled, shoving Lucas hard, but it wasn't enough to break his grip. Lucas's fingers snatched at Daniel's coat pocket, and with a cruel yank, he tore the crumpled paper free. Daniel froze, horror washing over him as Lucas stepped back, holding the letter in his hand like a trophy. "What's this?" Lucas said, waving the paper in the air. "A secret treasure map? Your last will and testament." "Give it back," Daniel said, his voice shaking. Lucas ignored him, his eyes scanning the words on the page. His smirk faltered slightly as he read, but he recovered quickly, turning the letter toward his friends. "Let's see what's so important, shall we?" "Stop," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. Emily lunged for the letter, but Lucas held it out of her reach. "Relax, it's just a piece of paper," Lucas said, his tone dismissive. He glanced back at Daniel, sneering. "Why are you getting so worked up? Is this all you have? Some stupid, scribbled note?" Daniel's hands clenched into fists. The blood rushed to his head, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. "You don't understand," he said, his voice raw. "Understand what?" Lucas shot back. "That you're a joke. That you're nothing." Emily turned on Lucas, her face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." Lucas laughed, but it sounded forced. He held up the letter again, shaking it for emphasis. "Oh, please. What is this even supposed to be? It looks like something a little kid wrote." "It's not," Daniel shouted. Lucas blinked, startled by the force of Daniel's voice. For the first time, the boy who never spoke was shouting, really shouting, and it caught everyone off guard. "It's not just some piece of paper," Daniel said, his chest heaving. "It's a letter from my mom." The words hung in the air like a slap. The courtyard went silent. Even Lucas's friends stopped snickering, their eyes flicking between Lucas and Daniel, unsure of what to do. Lucas faltered. "What?" Daniel stepped forward, his gaze burning with an intensity none of them had ever seen before. "You heard me. It's a letter from my mom. She wrote it for me before she died." Lucas's smirk vanished completely. He looked down at the letter in his hand, as if suddenly realizing what he was holding. Daniel's voice trembled, but he didn't stop. "It's the only thing I have left of her. It's all I have. And you," he swallowed hard, his hand shaking. "You're too stupid to understand what that means." Emily gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She turned to Lucas, her expression furious. "How could you?" Lucas said nothing. He looked stunned, like someone had punched the air out of his lungs. Daniel held out his hand. "Give it back." For a moment, Lucas didn't move. He just stared at the letter, his face pale. Then, without a word, he held it out to Daniel. Daniel snatched it back, his hands trembling as he carefully smoothed out the crumpled paper. He held it close to his chest, his shoulders heaving with every breath. "I didn't know," Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible. "You didn't care," Emily snapped. All you cared about was making yourself feel better by tearing someone else down. Well, congratulations, Lucas. You got what you wanted. Lucas looked at her, guilt flickering across his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Daniel turned and walked away without another word, clutching the letter like a lifeline. The crowd parted for him, the other kids watching him with wide eyes, their earlier laughter replaced with shame. Daniel didn't stop walking until he reached the far side of the schoolyard, where a crumbling brick wall offered some privacy. He sat down on the cold ground, his back against the wall, and unfolded the letter. The words were familiar, so familiar that he could have recited them by heart, but he read them anyway, his lips moving silently. Daniel, no matter what happens, always remember who you are. You are strong. You are loved. And one day, you will prove to the world just how much you matter. Tears blurred his vision, but he blinked them away, forcing himself to breathe. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, gentle and steady, reminding him of the promise she had made to him. You matter, he whispered to himself. You matter. Daniel. He looked up, startled to see Emily standing a few feet away. She hesitated before stepping closer, her expression soft. Are you okay? She asked. Daniel didn't know how to answer that. He felt raw, like Lucas had ripped him open in front of everyone. But at the same time, there was something else, something almost like relief. I'm fine, he muttered, wiping his eyes quickly. Emily sat down beside him, her coat brushing against his arm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I'm sorry about what happened, Emily said quietly. Lucas is awful. He had no right to do that to you. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't know how to explain to her that this was nothing new, that people like Lucas had always been there, ready to remind him of what he didn't have. I didn't know about your mom, Emily continued softly. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded, staring down at the letter. It's okay. You couldn't have known. They sat in silence for a while, the cold wind whistling around them. Finally, Emily spoke again. You're brave, you know that? Daniel blinked, looking at her in surprise. What? You're brave, she repeated. Most people would have fallen apart after what Lucas did. But you didn't. You stood up to him. You told the truth. Daniel looked away, his face flushing slightly. It didn't feel brave. It was, Emily said firmly. You showed everyone that you're stronger than Lucas will ever be. Daniel looked down at the letter again, his mother's words glowing in his mind like a flame. You are strong. You are loved. For the first time in a long time, he believed it. The school bell rang, jolting Daniel and Emily out of their quiet moment by the brick wall. Kids began pouring out of the building, their chatter filling the air, but it felt distant, like noise in the background of a movie. Daniel stood up, carefully folding the letter and tucking it safely into his pocket. You ready? Emily asked, rising to her feet beside him. Daniel shrugged. I don't know. Emily gave him a reassuring smile. You don't have to face them alone. Her words settled something inside Daniel, something he couldn't name. For so long, he had felt like he was on his own, carrying his struggles like a weight no one else could see. But Emily, she made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry it all by himself. As they walked toward the gates, Daniel noticed the other kids staring at him, whispering, glancing away when he caught their eyes. He could feel the shift in their energy. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was something else. Guilt. He spotted Lucas leaning against the fence with his friends, but they weren't laughing this time. Lucas stood stiffly, his face pale, his hands shoved into his pockets. When he saw Daniel approaching, he straightened up and looked at him with something Daniel couldn't quite place. Shame, maybe. Emily noticed Lucas too, her expression hardening. Don't let him say anything else to you, she whispered. But Lucas didn't say a word. As Daniel walked past, Lucas opened his mouth like he was going to speak, then closed it again. For once, he looked uncertain, small. Daniel kept walking, not stopping to give Lucas a second glance. The walk home felt different that afternoon. The usual weight on Daniel's shoulders was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. It was as if telling the truth, standing up for himself, even just a little, had lightened the burden. Emily walked beside him, the two of them quiet as they trudged through the streets. It was colder now, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rows of houses. Where do you live? Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel hesitated, his gaze fixed on the sidewalk. At the shelter. Emily's steps faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Oh, I didn't know. It's not so bad, Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. It's better than nothing. Emily nodded, as though trying to understand. How long have you been there? A couple of years, Daniel replied. Since my mom died. Emily looked at him, her expression soft. I'm sorry. Daniel shrugged. It's not your fault. They reached the edge of the block, where the street split into two directions. Daniel stopped, glancing at Emily. This is where I go. Emily looked down the street, her brow furrowing. Will you be okay? I'm always okay, Daniel said quietly. Emily didn't look convinced. I'll see you tomorrow. Daniel nodded. Yeah. She hesitated for a moment before giving him a small smile. Good. And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Daniel didn't know what to say, so he just nodded again. He watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing down the street before turning and heading toward the shelter. The shelter was noisy when Daniel got back. Kids of all ages filled the small, overcrowded space, their voices echoing off the walls. A few sat at tables in the common room, doing homework or playing games. Others sprawled out on the worn couches, watching the flickering television that sat in the corner. Daniel wove through the chaos, keeping his head down. He didn't feel like talking to anyone. He just wanted to go to his cot to be alone. When he reached his corner of the room, he sank onto the thin mattress and pulled the letter out of his pocket. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases with his fingers. You are strong. You are loved. And one day you will prove to the world just how much you matter. His mother's handwriting was neat but slightly uneven, the ink faded with age. He traced the words with his fingertip, hearing her voice in his mind. Daniel, no matter what happens. The tears came suddenly, hot and unstoppable. He pressed the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking as the sobs racked his small frame. He tried to keep quiet, but the emotions he had held back for so long broke free all at once. For the first time in years, he let himself grieve. For his mother. For everything he had lost. For the way the world had treated him, as if he didn't matter. But he did matter. His mother believed it. And now maybe so did he. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling different. Lighter somehow. He dressed quickly, pulling on the same patched clothes, and grabbed his bag. As he left the shelter, he slipped the letter into his pocket, where it felt safe. The walk to school was colder than usual, frost glittering on the grass and sidewalks, but Daniel barely noticed. For once, he wasn't dreading what the day might bring. When he reached the school gates, the usual noise and chaos greeted him. Kids laughing, running, calling out to each other. But something had changed. They weren't staring at him anymore. Oh, they noticed him, sure. A few kids glanced at him as he walked past, but they didn't laugh. They didn't whisper. Lucas was nowhere to be seen. Daniel walked toward the steps, his chin slightly higher than it had been the day before. Hey. He turned to see Emily jogging toward him, her ponytail bouncing. She smiled as she reached him, her breath fogging in the cold air. I saved you a seat in class, she said. Daniel blinked, surprised. You did? Yeah, Emily replied. Come on. For the first time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He followed Emily through the doors and into the bustling hallway, where kids filled their lockers and talked about their weekend plans. No one paid much attention to him, and for once, that was okay. When they reached the classroom, Emily led him to a desk near the front, right next to hers. Daniel sat down, feeling out of place, but strangely welcome. You're not sitting in the back today? Emily teased lightly. Daniel shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not today. Lucas walked into the classroom just as the bell rang. He stopped short when he saw Daniel sitting near the front, his expression flickering with something Daniel couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. Lucas didn't say anything as he took his usual seat, and for the first time, he didn't look back at Daniel. The teacher began the lesson, her voice filling the room as she wrote notes on the chalkboard. Daniel opened his notebook and started to write, his pencil moving steadily across the page. About halfway through the lesson, a small slip of paper landed on his desk. Daniel frowned, glancing around, but no one was looking at him. He unfolded the note and read the words scribbled inside. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked up, his gaze flicking to Lucas. Lucas wasn't looking at him, but his face was flushed, and his eyes were fixed firmly on his desk. For a moment, Daniel just stared. He wasn't sure what to feel. Then he folded the note and tucked it into his notebook. He didn't need Lucas's apology. He didn't need validation from anyone. Because he already knew who he was. He was Daniel. He was strong. He was loved. And that was enough. The day moved slowly, the steady hum of pencils scratching paper, and the teacher's voice echoing off the classroom walls. Daniel kept his head down, his focus fixed on his notebook. He wasn't hiding this time. He was just steady, grounded. The note Lucas had written, "I'm sorry," was folded neatly in his pocket, but he didn't need to look at it again. He wasn't sure how he felt about Lucas's sudden change of heart. Part of him still hurt. The scars of being laughed at and humiliated didn't disappear overnight. But another part of him felt lighter, like the weight Lucas had tried to pin on him was no longer his to carry. "Daniel." He looked up, startled, to see Emily watching him from the desk beside his. The rest of the class was bent over their work, but she had turned to face him, her expression curious. "What?" Daniel whispered. "Are you okay?" Emily asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. Why?" Emily gave him a small, knowing smile. "You look different today. Happier." Daniel blinked at her, unsure of how to respond. "She saw through me," Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And now I don't know how to make it right." His father sighed on the other end of the line. "Son, I've told you before, life isn't about games or winning. If she saw through you, maybe it's time you see through yourself." "What does that even mean?" Alexander asked, pacing his office. "It means you need to figure out who you are without all the trappings of wealth and pride," his father said. "And if you're lucky, maybe she'll see that man and believe in him. But you have to believe in him first." The words hit harder than Alexander expected. He hung up soon after, his father's advice lingering in his mind. For years, Alexander had defined himself by his success, his charm, and his ability to control any situation. But for the first time, none of that mattered. The next morning, Alexander showed up at the grocery store, wearing jeans and a simple sweatshirt. He didn't look like the polished businessman Emily had come to know, and when she spotted him by the produce aisle, her brow furrowed in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone cautious. Alexander smiled hesitantly. "I came to help." "Help?" Emily echoed, folding her arms. "Why?" "Because I need to start somewhere," he said simply. "And I thought maybe I could start by doing something useful for once." Emily stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but don't get in my way." For the next several hours, Alexander followed Emily's lead, stocking shelves, bagging groceries, and even sweeping the floors. He fumbled through the tasks at first, earning a few amused looks from customers and coworkers, but he didn't complain. By the end of the day, his arms ached, his shirt was damp with sweat, and he'd never felt more satisfied. As they locked up the store that evening, Emily glanced over at him. "Why are you really doing this, Alexander?" He met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I want to understand your world, Emily. I want to understand you. And I know I have a long way to go, but I'm willing to try." Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she handed him the keys to the lock and gestured toward the door. "You can lock up tonight. I'll see you tomorrow." Over the next few weeks, Alexander became a regular fixture at the grocery store. He showed up every morning, ready to work alongside Emily and the rest of the staff. He learned the ins and outs of running the store, from dealing with difficult customers to managing inventory. Slowly but surely, he began to earn the respect of the people around him, and more importantly, Emily. One afternoon, as they were unloading a delivery truck, Emily leaned against a crate of canned goods and watched Alexander struggle with a particularly heavy box. "You know," she said, smirking, "I didn't think you'd last more than a day." Alexander set the box down with a grunt and straightened up, wiping his brow. "Honestly, neither did I." They both laughed, the sound light and unguarded. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them seemed to ease. You've changed, Emily said after a moment, her tone thoughtful. Because of you, Alexander replied without hesitation. You make me want to be better, Emily. She looked away, her cheeks flushing faintly. You've still got a lot to prove. I know, he said softly, and I'm not going anywhere. One evening, as they closed up the store, Emily handed Alexander a cup of coffee and gestured for him to sit with her on the curb outside. The street was quiet, the sky painted with the soft hues of twilight. Tell me something, Emily said, breaking the silence. Why did you make that bet in the first place? Alexander hesitated, then sighed. Because I was arrogant. I thought I could have anything, anyone, without consequence. I was wrong. Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. Do you still think that way? No, he said firmly. Meeting you changed everything. You showed me that life isn't about winning. It's about connection, about being real. And for the first time, I want that more than anything else. Emily took a sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It's going to take time, Alexander. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. I'm willing to wait, he said quietly, as long as it takes. Months passed, and slowly but surely, Alexander and Emily began to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but they faced them together. Alexander continued to work at the store, proving through his actions that he was committed to being a part of Emily's world. One day, as they stood side by side in the stockroom, Emily turned to him with a small smile. You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you walked into the store that day. Alexander chuckled, his heart swelling. Even if I made a complete fool of myself. Especially because of that, she said, laughing. It showed me that even someone like you can change. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. Only because of you. As they stood there, surrounded by shelves of canned goods and boxes of cereal, Alexander realized that for the first time in his life, he felt truly at home. And he knew without a doubt that he would spend the rest of his days proving to Emily and to himself that love was worth fighting for. Daniel stared at Emily for a moment before shrugging. I don't know. I guess I just feel different. Different how? Emily pressed, her voice soft. Daniel looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. Like, it doesn't matter anymore. What they say, what they think. It's not as heavy as it used to be. Emily's smile widened, her eyes lighting up. That's because it's not heavy, Daniel. Not anymore. You don't have to carry it. He didn't know what to say to that, but deep down, he knew she was right. For so long, he had let the weight of other people's opinions crush him. He had let their words define him, their laughter echo inside his head like a curse. But now things were different. The truth was out. He had stood up for himself, even when it had felt impossible. And somehow that had changed everything. When the bell rang for lunch, Daniel grabbed his bag and stood up, feeling a strange kind of calm wash over him. Emily waited for him by the door, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate to walk beside her. As they stepped out into the courtyard, Daniel felt the usual sea of eyes settle on him. The other kids were watching, whispering, but this time it wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. They're still staring, Daniel mumbled, his shoulders tensing. Emily rolled her eyes. Let them stare. It's because you did something they could never do. What's that? You showed them who you really are. Daniel didn't respond, but her words echoed in his mind. For so long, he had felt invisible, insignificant. But now for the first time, people were looking at him for who he was, not what he wore or where he lived. They sat at their usual spot near the edge of the courtyard, where the wind carried faint smells of cafeteria food and the noise of kids playing echoed in the distance. Emily pulled out her lunch, unwrapping a sandwich and handing Daniel an extra apple she had packed. You didn't have to, Daniel said, though he took it gratefully. I know, Emily replied with a grin. But I wanted to. Daniel bit into the apple, the sweetness filling his mouth. It was simple, but to him, it felt like a feast. He glanced up and noticed Lucas standing near the cafeteria doors. He was alone, his group nowhere in sight. Lucas's gaze flicked toward Daniel before he quickly looked away, his expression unreadable. He looks lost without his audience, Emily muttered, following Daniel's gaze. Daniel didn't say anything, but part of him felt something strange, pity. Lucas had spent so much time building himself up by tearing others down, But now, without his friends to back him up, he seems smaller. Do you think he's really sorry? Daniel asked quietly. Emily frowned, considering the question. I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes it takes a lot for people to realize they've been wrong. Daniel looked down at the apple in his hand, his brow furrowing. I don't know if I can forgive him. You don't have to, Emily said softly. Not right away. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. Daniel nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. Forgiveness. He didn't know if he was ready for that yet, but for the first time, it felt like a possibility, something he might reach for someday. The afternoon passed quickly, and before Daniel knew it, the final bell was ringing. He gathered his things and headed for the door, surprised to see Lucas lingering near the entrance. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Lucas looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure what to do with his hands or where to look. Hey, Lucas said finally, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. Daniel stopped, waiting. Lucas shifted from one foot to the other, avoiding Daniel's gaze. I wanted to say sorry. For real, this time. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard him right. Lucas looked up, his expression serious. I mean it. What I did, it wasn't okay. I didn't know about your mom. I didn't know. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. You didn't want to know, he said quietly. Lucas flinched, but he nodded. You're right. I didn't. I don't know. I thought making fun of you made me look stronger or something. But it didn't. It just made me a jerk. Daniel stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but there was none. Lucas looked sincere. Small. I don't expect you to forgive me, Lucas added quickly. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. The words hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Finally, he nodded. Okay. Lucas looked surprised. Okay. Daniel shrugged. I don't know if I forgive you yet, but thanks for saying that. Lucas looked relieved, though he didn't smile. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of kids heading for the buses. Emily appeared beside Daniel, watching Lucas go. What did he want? Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. To say sorry. Do you believe him? I don't know, Daniel admitted. But it's a start. Emily smiled, nudging him lightly. You're a better person than I am. Daniel shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I don't think so. They walked toward the gates together, the sun setting behind them, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. That evening, Daniel sat on his cot at the shelter, the letter from his mother spread out in front of him. He read the words again, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. You are strong. You are loved. And one day, you will prove to the world just how much you matter. He thought about Lucas's apology, about Emily's kindness, about the way the other kids had looked at him today, not with pity or mockery, but with something else. Respect. Understanding. His mother had been right. He had proven to the world that he mattered, not with money or fancy clothes or loud words, but with quiet strength, with the courage to be himself, even when the world tried to tear him down. Daniel folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into his pocket. It was still his most treasured possession, but now it wasn't the only thing he carried. He carried his mother's love, his own sense of worth, and the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid. Because he knew who he was. And that was enough. The next morning, the air was crisp and cool, the kind of morning that carried the promise of something new. Daniel stepped out of the shelter, his breath visible in the cold, and started his walk to school. The familiar routine felt different today. His steps were steadier, his shoulders a little straighter. He had spent so long trying to disappear, trying to shrink himself so the world wouldn't notice him. But not anymore. When he reached the school gates, the usual noise greeted him. Kids talking, laughing, running through the yard. This time, Daniel didn't feel the weight of their eyes. He didn't care if they were looking at him. As he walked across the courtyard, a few kids actually nodded at him in acknowledgement, small, subtle gestures that felt monumental to Daniel. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. Emily was waiting for him near the steps, holding a book in her hands. She grinned when she saw him. You're early. Daniel shrugged. Thought I'd try something new. Emily laughed softly. Come on. I saved you a seat again. They walked inside together, side by side. The hallway buzzed with life as kids hurried to their lockers and classrooms, but Daniel didn't feel out of place. When they reached their classroom, Daniel hesitated just before stepping inside. Emily paused, looking at him. What's wrong? Nothing, Daniel said. He took a deep breath, his hand brushing the letter in his pocket for reassurance. I'm ready. The day passed in a blur of lessons and chatter, but something had shifted. Kids who once ignored Daniel now greeted him with shy smiles or quiet nods. A few even muttered apologies as they passed him in the hallway. Lucas kept his distance. He sat at his usual desk, his head down, his presence quieter than before. He didn't speak to Daniel, but that was okay. Daniel wasn't looking for more apologies. By lunchtime, the unease Daniel once felt in the cafeteria was gone. He sat with Emily at their usual spot, munching on the apple she handed him without hesitation. Have you noticed how everyone's acting different today? Emily said, biting into her sandwich. Daniel shrugged. A little. It's because of you, she said firmly. You stood up to Lucas. You showed them that it's not okay to treat people the way they did. Daniel looked down at his apple, his fingers tracing its smooth surface. I don't feel like I did anything special. You did, Emily said softly. You showed them who you really are, and you made them see you. Daniel didn't know what to say. It was strange hearing someone speak about him that way. For so long, he had believed that he didn't matter, that the world would keep moving whether he was there or not. But now for the first time, it felt like his existence meant something. I just wanted them to stop, he said finally. Emily smiled. And they did. Because you're stronger than all of them. Daniel thought about that for a moment, letting her words settle over him. Strong. He had never thought of himself as strong before. But maybe strength wasn't about fighting back or being loud. Maybe strength was about standing tall even when the world tried to push you down. After school, Daniel lingered by the gates as kids filed out, their voices filling the air. He spotted Lucas again, standing alone by the fence. This time, Lucas looked up and met Daniel's gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Lucas nodded. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. A silent acknowledgement. Daniel nodded back. It was enough. Ready to go? Emily asked, appearing beside him. Yeah, Daniel said. They walked together down the street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Daniel shoved his hands into his pockets, feeling the familiar weight of the letter against his fingers. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise, a reminder of everything he had overcome, of everything he still had to look forward to. You know what's funny? Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence. What? I think Lucas learned something from all this, too. Daniel glanced at her, curious. Like what? Emily grinned. That being a bully doesn't make you powerful. It just makes you small. Daniel smiled faintly. He didn't know if Lucas had learned that lesson yet, but he hoped he had. He hoped Lucas would remember the look on Daniel's face when he told the truth, when he stood tall and refused to let anyone take that moment from him. Maybe, Daniel said quietly. They reached the corner where their paths split, and Emily stopped, turning to face him. Are you okay? Daniel nodded. Yeah, I'm okay. She smiled. Good. I'll see you tomorrow. Daniel watched as she walked away, her figure shrinking into the distance. When she was gone, he turned and headed toward the shelter, his steps light and sure. That evening, as the sun set behind a rows of buildings, Daniel sat on his cot and unfolded the letter once more. The words were as familiar as ever, but they felt different now. You are strong. You are loved. And one day, you will prove to the world just how much you matter. Daniel smiled softly, his mother's words glowing like a flame in the darkness. He had always believed those words were meant to comfort him, to give him hope when he felt lost. But now he realized they were more than that. They were a truth he had carried with him all along. He was strong. He was loved. And he mattered. The world might try to knock him down again. There would be more struggles, more challenges, more people like Lucas who would try to tear him apart. But Daniel knew something now, something they could never take away from him. He knew who he was, and that was enough. As Daniel folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket, he lay down on the cot, staring up at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Tomorrow would come, and he would face it head-on. Because no matter what the world threw at him, he knew he would stand tall. Because he mattered.